Greetings. Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, February 10th, 2020. Time for mathematics and statistics. Today, however, hoping to convince you that you're a mathematician. That includes those of you who hate math, despise math, never want to see another math course or do a math problem the rest of your lives. And yet, here to tell you, you are already a mathematician, are a mathematician every single day. They're not. So the next series of vlogs are going to be devoted to deep truths in each of the different subject matters. And what I mean by that is that to the extent possible, we're going to dive as deeply into the incontrovertible truths based on contemporary human reasoning, suggesting that everyone's going to agree with the deep truths, a consensus as to exactly what these are. By and large, the focus is on the foundations of our knowledge, our understanding, what seems to apply almost universally across the different subject matters. So we're going to start, though, with the least controversial. That is mathematics, the objective analysis of numbers. And at least, in terms of mathematics, we can still agree, for example, that that there's a consensus that 1 plus 1 equals 2, for example. There's consensus about the Pythagorean theorem and its utility, its consistency. There are numbers that apply to world records in terms of sprinting or swimming records, down to the hundredth of a second, even finer gradations if you like. There are standard practices that apply the use and application of numbers, for which there's almost or essentially no disagreement. Okay, including just the raw difference between having $10 in your pocket versus $1,000 in your pocket. That means, in terms of your culture and its purchase power, etc., those are different questions. I'm just talking strictly about themselves. So, most importantly, then, for today's vlog, here's the deepest truth. Whether you like it or not, you're already a mathematician. Every day of your life, you can't avoid it. You're constantly working with numbers, formulae, recipes, and equations. Time you rise in the morning to the moment where you lay your head down at night to go to sleep. So, for example, most people will look at a clock or try to figure out or anticipate based on what time they get up, how much time they'll have, how many hours of sleep that they can get. And of course, at the same time, we'll often calculate once we wake up just how many hours we've slept. Remarkably, then, we're almost always doing math right from the get-go, right from our earliest waking moments. And perhaps we'll figure out how much longer we can sleep before we really have to get up. That's math too. Or we'll do a slightly more sophisticated version whereby we'll calculate how much time we have before we have to go to work, about how much time we have for additional sleep, desired, and how much time it'll take to prepare, then actually take the trip to work. That's not only math, that's algebra. Yes, you're solving an equation whereby you're evaluating the total amount of time that you have until you have to be at work, and then solving for the total amount of time you have available for 3 or more parameters. Snooze time, getting ready time, then your travel time. And some of you might have failed algebra, right? And you were especially concerned about those dreaded word problems, right? With the cars traveling at different speeds and so forth. But again, you do have to calculate the speed, at least of your own vehicle or the bus or the train, perhaps, and then try to work out some unknown parameters on top of all that, based on, for example, the day of the week that you're traveling. How crowded will your commute be? Are there weather concerns or accidents and so forth? All that's math. And thank goodness you have a brain and you actually do engage in the calculations that allow you to get to work on time. Or at least you'll be able to estimate how late you're going to be if you're not going to make it to work on time. If you drill down a bit further, though, what else are you calculating with respect to time? Well, time for a shower, shaving, ironing clothes, perhaps. How much time do you have for any morning chores? Making the bed, perhaps? Feeding a pet or taking one out for a walk? What about time for meal preparation? Factor that into your equation? Or at least you'll be able to estimate, as I say, if nothing else, how long you have until you absolutely have to get to work. And then what's required from that moment as you step out the door. And of course, unfortunately, as you know, sometimes things go awry. Even our best estimates may fall short for a variety of different reasons. In any event, it's all math. Not all the time, but most of what we do in terms of organizing our lives on a daily basis involves some degree and some sophistication with respect to mathematics. Moving past time, what about those meals that I alluded to a moment ago? You have to determine how much you're going to eat, what kinds. Are you tracking your calories, for example? Are you looking at your intake in terms of sodium, carbohydrates, or other measures of consumption? Are you dieting or making trade-offs in terms of a little bit of this food versus a little bit of that food? And there's a fair bit of math involved there as well. What about vitamins? Are you keeping tabs on your daily requirements, meeting your daily recommended allowances? Maybe you're ignoring that one, but on the other hand, there's still math, and even if you're not into the vitamin issue. Same with your medications, especially in relation to your weight. For that matter, you might be looking at dosages and in relation to your weight and age, and much more. So, speaking of weight, how much do you weigh? Most of us have a general sense of how much we weigh. And by the way, you don't have to answer me. I don't want to be rude, but I'm just throwing it out there, right? But there again, you might even start to use algebra in determining how many calories you can consume, for example, in relation to how much exercise you plan, or what do you need to do to maintain a healthy weight. Or you might have to tweak the equation a little bit to determine just how many calories that you'll need to shed a few pounds. Say nothing of outright dieting. You're going to be tracking your weight a variety of different ways, and all of that involves mathematics. Oh, what about distance? More math, right? So how far do you have to travel to work? That's the basic question. Not just how long will it take, but how far do you have to go? And what's the optimal route for getting there efficiently? Now you might be engaged in a bit of analytic geometry, even if you never took the course in high school. What mode of transportation will allow you to traverse the necessary distance in the most efficient manner possible? And crucially, you'll have to determine the relationship between time and distance to work, especially in light of your options. And you're doing, in that sense, a bit of basic calculus without necessarily going through all the formal operations. And you say that you hate math, and yet you're already a heck of a mathematician. You just don't think of it necessarily. And so math factors into almost everything that we do on a daily basis. So for example, anytime that we ask the question, is it worth it? A level of mathematics involved. Answer that question. Is it affordable? That's one we're certain to ask. And if we are wondering about whether it's affordable, how much can we afford? And that's where we have to look at daily allowances or perhaps monthly budgets. Sure, we might use technologies like spreadsheets or even a smartphone to help us manage our finances, to be fair. Might hire someone to do formal aspects, the taxes and so on. But nonetheless, on a regular basis, we have to look into our finances and our budgets and make calculations and allocations, withholdings. There are all kinds of micro decisions that we make about buying coffee or cheapest gas, and all of that involves math. Every time we calculate the relative value of something, every time we track how much we spend and calculate the change that we should get back, paid for something, or how much we've saved with a special bargain, we're doing math. Do you have any kids? Maybe you don't. But if you do, or what if you're planning to have kids, for example? More math. I don't just mean how many kids. It's the most basic math imaginable. But in addition, what about raising kids? The latest estimates suggest, for example, that to raise an infant from birth to age 17 will cost the average Canadian about $300,000. That's not too different in the US as far as that goes. In other words, that's more than $17,000 per year. Factor that into your budget. Base that on your earnings. See where you end up. But who says the costs end only at age 17? That's redonkulous. I can assure you the costs don't end just because our children have reached legal age of 18. Legal age varies across provinces and territories and states and so on, but nonetheless, you get the point. But more importantly, my point is we still spend thousands of dollars on our children after they turn 18 too, perhaps well into their 20s, maybe even beyond. In other words, it really never stops. Just as the worrying never stops, the spending never stops. Now, it does typically decline. Hopefully, if things go well, the youngsters start to earn a bit of money for themselves and so forth. But nonetheless, I'm just suggesting that we're always factoring in time and money, even once our kids grow up. Okay? Again, I'm not complaining. These are sunk costs. Probably never going to get them back. Never know. Come around. Back around, I should say. Maybe the kids will take care of us one day and after us financially and spend money on us, etc. Actually, not yet. It's not in our case. Okay. And then, of course, family and household budgets are real. These are real things that we have to deal with, all of us. And housing costs are almost invariably the number one expenditure in most of our budgets. That's the thing that we spend the most amount. And then we're typically going to spend as much as a third on our housing, sometimes more. Sometimes we're really strapped in terms of our housing expenses relative to everything else we have to do. Limited funds. So housing is typically the number one issue. But in addition, we also have to look at transportation costs, food costs. Those are usually top three: housing, transportation, and food. But in addition, what about utilities? Not everyone has to pay them. Again, that might be built into your rents and that sort of thing. Utilities represent another cost. Insurance, health-related cost, and depending on where you live, kind of insurance you have, etc. And then there are, of course, all the non-essentials. That is to say, the personal spending, treating of ourselves, the recreation, the entertainment, etc. So ideally, I should say, even in addition to all of that, we also typically want to track our savings. If we have any. Hopefully we do. And then there's the debt issue in relation to all of that as well. How much do we owe the banks? What interest rates do we happen to be paying? What mortgage rates do we happen to be paying? How much credit card debt do we have? Debt from other loans. And then there are taxes on top of all of that. Now, of course, in return for our taxes, hopefully we get a lot of benefits or budget offsets, if you will. If you think about things like universal health care and public education, we're paying for those issues or those items, but through our taxes typically. Same with our police and our fire protection and public roads and parks and all kinds of safety and other forms of protection as well. That's all, of course, part of the broader kind of social contract we have since we most of us in industrial or advanced industrial societies. Be different, obviously, if we're hunter-gatherer or horticultural societies, but not many people are these days, obviously. So when you live in a place like Canada or the United States, we have to engage in some rather sophisticated mathematics to track and manage our household budgets, our monthly expenses, our investments, and ultimately for our retirements as well. Or if you're not convinced yet that you're a mathematician, then think of just the many different scales that we use on an everyday basis to assess our weight. How much do we weigh? Measure the recipe amounts that we might be using, or to determine how much gas we have left in the tank, how many more miles we can get out of that tank, that sort of thing. Or even consider how often we have to use a tape measure, right? To get the right curtain lengths, to design the living spaces that we have, what's going to fit where, to build a deck, or just to measure our heights. So I've barely scratched the surface in terms of everyday mathematics, right? And not even considered the extent, for example, to which we have to use math in our professional lives. Again, most of us do. And in our work lives in general, whatever the nature of the work that you're doing, we all have to use math on the job. Not just because we're accountants or engineers or because we teach high school mathematics or whatever. Because even if we're teaching kindergarten, we have to know, obviously, how many kids we have in our class. We also have to plan for activities. We have to make sure we have the resources. We have to make sure if we go on field trips that we have enough parents, enough adults, in terms of what the appropriate ratio should be in terms of students to adults. That's mathematics. That's a form of statistics, in fact. We have to do all of these things. How much is it going to cost to go on this field trip? How much do we have to get from each child or from each family? But again, think of whatever it is. Think of if you clean houses for a living. There's tons of math involved there too, right? As with any business, private business or services that you're providing. Obviously, anything involving cost require mathematics in terms of how we're to be compensated, how much time we anticipate that the task is going to take, what are the cost of the tools and the materials, and so forth. And again, even with our work, we have to ask, is it worth it? What's our net gain from a financial standpoint? If not to mention other kinds of gains, other kinds of benefits we might get. And then, of course, there are our computers, our smartphones, a lot more math. Tracking files and file sizes, sending messages, monitoring our inboxes, data plans, configuring devices, the available memory or RAM, enhancing our processing speeds, and so much more. So we're doing little calculations all the time with our computers and our electronic devices. And perhaps even little experiments too to see what works better in one context or another. And then there are all the surprising little ways that we use math, like the recording industry. If you talk about recording music, for example, we have to use math to determine our rhythms or our tempos, or when to add in new instruments, the timing, how to track and mix the volumes, and so forth. All of that involves some degree of mathematics. There's even a critical piece of math that I had to consider in preparing for my debut album. I learned, for example, and I didn't know this previously, I just took it for granted that, albums would be of a certain length, had a certain number of songs and that sort of thing. But there's actually an optimal, or better to say a maximum, amount of time you can have on one recorded side of an old-style vinyl album. And typically, the limit is 25 minutes, but most experts and professionals recommend that you have even less music on each side. In fact, the real maximum shouldn't be more than about 22 minutes of music per side. It's literally going to affect the nature of the grooves that are made, that are cut into the records. If you have too many minutes, if you exceed these kind of, unofficial limits, if you will, then what that means is that you'll have to cut shallower grooves. And that leads to potential deterioration in terms of the sound quality, in terms of increased surface noise, and indeed even a higher risk of record damage. So I had to take all of this into account when I was cutting my first album. Say that's why we say we cut an album. It's to do with grooves in the vinyl records. But I had wanted the songs in a particular order and to tell a particular story, right? So I was lucky that it worked out to a certain extent because I wanted them. Each song was to represent a chapter in telling the story, and I was a little bit concerned because one of the songs was going to take me a little bit over the 22-minute maximum. I had a 1-minute solo planned for the end of one song. I'd written this originally or had this formulated in the concept of what I wanted to do, but I decided to cut out that ending. I won't tell you which song, but I had to cut out the ending. As I say, it's about a minute soloing and so forth. And the idea was to make that one song a little bit shorter, and then in turn, because if I'd kept it in, the time on that side of the album would have been about 23 minutes and 30 seconds. So by cutting out that solo, I kept that side of the album down to just over 22 minutes total time. So anyway, that's what made all the difference. So anyway, we could spend a lot more time then talking about everyday mathematics, but I trust that you see the point that you are a mathematician already, and you are every day of your life, okay? And mathematics encompasses a deep truth about your experience, without which your life would be pretty chaotic in many respects. So, and I don't just mean in terms of our daily schedules, but in terms of determining and monitoring so much of our daily activities in our lives. We're routinely measuring time and distance with mathematics, as well as their interrelationships. And we're monitoring all kinds of quantities, like our consumption patterns, the economics of everyday living, and so on. And we're usually assessing efficiencies with our mathematics as well. Right? That is to say, how can we most efficiently expend our energies to accomplish specific tasks? Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we formally put it all into equation, but we are looking for, however informally, and usually by using some basic type of mathematics, trying to determine how to use our energies a little bit more efficiently. And of course, that isn't just for our own selves and our own individual well-being. We're often doing that, applying that logic to our families, within our communities, within our societies. And in fact, we need mathematics to understand the dynamics of the planet as a whole. So we have to look at the numbers, how these affect or help us to evaluate how we're living our lives, how we're able to maintain our health, and indeed, a whole host of other aspects that directly and indirectly affect our quality of life. We're having to use mathematics to determine or to ensure, for example, that we're keeping lead out of our drinking water. And sometimes we mess that up. So we have to be aware of the mathematics and the fundamental conditions to which we're exposed. And we apply these types of mathematics in 1,000 different spheres. If we ignore the mathematics, we do so at our own individual collective peril. So my advice would be to continue to hone your mathematical skills further. Even if you don't see yourself as a math person, even if you've hated math, quote unquote, all your lives. All right, well, that's enough for today. But guess what? I have one other little surprise, but it's for next week. I'm going to try to convince you not only that you're a mathematician, but next week I'm going to show you that you're also a statistician. Mathematics a little bit further in that direction. So you're pretty sophisticated, even if you're very self-effacing and very modest in your claims. But don't let anybody tell you you're not a mathematician, because you are a darn good one. All right, in the meantime, may you and yours, as ever, continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And I'll see you soon.